Things are heating up in the Caribbean as the United States is flexing its muscles against Venezuela in a so-called war on drugs. And today I want to do a deep dive into the subject, get a little bit more of a balanced view on what I think is going on in the Venezuela situation. So if you're interested to get a more balanced perspective of some of the things that are going on in this particular conflict, then I think you'll like this podcast. Since World War II, the United States has often treated Latin America as its strategic backyard, invoking doctrines of hemispheric dominance to keep rival powers out. The recent US military buildup around Venezuela, officially justified as counter-narcotics campaign against a narco-terrorist regime, appears to be the latest chapter in this legacy. Mounting evidence suggests Washington's goals go far beyond stemming drug trafficking, and my argument is that the US is leveraging the drug war as a pretext to reassert control over the Western Hemisphere, counter China's expanding influence in Latin America, secure critical resources such as oil and minerals, and exploit a strategic moment while Russia is weakened by its war in Ukraine. I will examine how US policy has shifted toward a neo-Monroe Doctrine revival, why Venezuela's vast oil reserves and untapped minerals are of vital interest, and how China's and Russia's roles factor into the equation. My analysis draws on historical precedent and recent developments, from US threats over the Panama Canal and massive IMF bailouts in the region to explicit statements by American officials, to piece together a comprehensive thesis. Contradictory perspectives, such as the US government's stated humanitarian intentions and the risks of military intervention, are also considered. To sum it all up, the American push against Caracas is not only or even primarily about drugs. It is about consolidating US primacy in a multipolar era by locking down the Western Hemisphere's geopolitics, resources, and strategic autonomy. In late 2025, the United States dramatically escalated its military posture in the Caribbean, deploying warships, aircraft, and thousands of troops near Venezuela. The Trump administration has framed this buildup as part of an armed conflict against drug cartels operating out of Venezuela, even carrying out over 20 strikes on boats it claims were smuggling narcotics. President Nicolas Maduro, whom US indictments label a drug kingpin, has been warned to step down under threat of American force. At face value, Washington's campaign appears to be a bold extension of the war on drugs into South America. Yet this explanation alone is unconvincing. Experts note Venezuela is not a major source of the fentanyl and cocaine plaguing the US market. So why is the US suddenly so fixated on Venezuela? To answer this, we must view current events against the broad canvas of US foreign policy since World War II. From the early Cold War onwards, American leaders have sought to preempt outside influence in Latin America, an approach rooted in the 1823 Monroe Doctrine warning European powers, and later the Soviets, to stay out of the hemisphere. During the Cold War, this meant toppling leftist governments and supporting friendly regimes to contain communism. Today, a new great power rivalry is unfolding. China's economic foray into Latin America and Russia's alliances with anti-US governments have triggered alarm in Washington. The US is responding by refocusing on its near abroad, even as it distances itself from traditional global engagements. This shift has been described by some as a turn towards neo-isolationism, though it might be more accurately seen as selective engagement, retrenching from far-flung entanglements like the Middle East nation building or over-reliance on NATO commitments, while doubling down on dominance in the Western Hemisphere. What I posit here is that the US pressure on Venezuela exemplifies this strategy. It contends that four interlocking motivations drive US actions. One, a geopolitical doctrine of hemispheric control, reviving the Monroe Doctrine ethos amid a relative pullback from global policing. Two, the use of narco-trafficking as a convenient casus belli to justify the intervention and erode the influence of China and other rivals in Latin America. A desire to secure strategic resources would be number 3, notably Venezuela's immense oil reserves and untapped critical minerals for US interests. And 4, timing the showdown while Russia is overextended in Ukraine and China is hesitant to directly confront the US in its backyard. In other words, seizing a window of opportunity in the emerging multipolar order where US dominance is under challenge, such as by BRICS. And I will explore each of these dimensions in depth, citing recent news, official statements, and historical parallels. Where evidence contradicts these claims, for instance, the US official stance on the potential pitfalls of intervention. Those counterpoints will be presented to enhance a nuanced analysis. Quote, "Today, we proudly proclaim to all to hear, the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well," end quote, declared US National Security Advisor John Bolton in April of 2019. With those words, Bolton, speaking on behalf of then President Donald Trump, explicitly resurrected a policy framework that had defined US-Latin America relations for 2 centuries. The original Monroe Doctrine of 1823 warned external powers against colonizing or meddling in the Americas. But over time, it was used to justify US hegemony in the region. During the Cold War, for example, President Ronald Reagan invoked it to rationalize military action preventing the spread of Marxism in Central America. Bolton's 2019 speech, which castigated Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua as a troika of tyranny, signaled that Washington once again viewed Latin America through a zero-sum sphere of influence lens, this time with an eye toward countering China and other emerging challengers. In practice, the Trump administration, both in its first term and now its return to office in 2025, has shown a marked willingness to sideline or redefine traditional alliances, such as questioning NATO's value or engaging in trade spats with close partners like Canada, in order to prioritize America's own strategic freedom of action. Some analysts have described this approach as America first isolationism, but a more precise characterization is a strategic unilateralism focused on the Western Hemisphere. The logic is that by consolidating control over its immediate neighborhood, the US can better secure its borders, project power, and check rivals without becoming bogged down in distant wars or multilateral restraints. Recent events underscore this hemispheric focus. In 2023 through 2025, Washington's attention increasingly turned southward. Senior US officials began openly warning about foreign encroachment in Latin America, and policy shifted from mere rhetoric to concrete actions. For instance, the US has aggressively challenged China's role in the Panama Canal, a vital choke point in the Americas. President Trump complaining that the 1999 handover of the canal to Panama was a bad deal, and fumed that China operates the canal. In early 2025, when Panama's new president showed openness to US concerns, Trump hinted at taking back control of the canal by force if necessary. This was accompanied by the Pentagon openly exploring military options to ensure US access to the canal. The US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, during a visit to Panama, stated bluntly, in reality or in perception, the communist Chinese have had designs on more control of this canal, and to that we say, not on our watch. His trip coincided with Panama's decision to exit China's Belt and Road Initiative and increase security cooperation with Washington. Such developments make clear that the US is reasserting a guardianship role over strategic assets in the hemisphere, a modern echo of Theodore Roosevelt's corollary that cast America as the policeman of the Caribbean. It is against this backdrop that Venezuela's crisis has drawn intense US focus. Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro, not only defied US influence, but also invited China, Russia, and Iran into the region via loans, oil deals, military ties to hawkish policymakers in Washington. This trespasses on the Monroe Doctrine's core tenet. In Bolton's words, quote, "The twilight of socialism has arrived in our hemisphere," end quote. A stark warning that regimes aligned against the US, be they socialist or simply allied to Beijing or Moscow, will no longer be tolerated. Thus, Washington increasingly hardline on Caracas can be seen as the test case of a broader strategy: push adversaries out of the Americas and cement US primacy over the Western Hemisphere's future. The drug war pretext: narco-terrorism or geopolitics. The official justification of this unprecedented military buildup is to stop Venezuelan-sourced narcotics from reaching American shores. In March of 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice unsealed indictments against Nicolas Maduro and his top associates, branding them as narco-terrorists involved in a cocaine trafficking conspiracy. By 2025, the President Trump administration had taken this narrative to dramatic heights. It declared that drug cartels, allegedly shielded by Maduro, pose an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, thereby justifying the use of military force. Under this banner, at least 21 Venezuelan boats have been attacked and some 80-plus people killed by the U.S. strikes in the latter half of 2025. At the time of recording, this is 13th of December, 2025. At a December cabinet meeting, Trump even signaled escalation. Quote, "We're going to start doing those strikes on land too. We know where they live." End quote. A clear hint that U.S. missiles or special forces might soon target ground sites in Venezuela, all under the auspices of war on drugs. However, scrutiny of the facts on the ground casts serious doubt on the idea that Venezuela is a key linchpin in the narcotics trade. Independent experts have repeatedly pointed out that Venezuela is not a significant source of fentanyl, the opioid that's driving record U.S. overdose deaths, and plays at most a limited role in cocaine smuggling, especially compared to Colombia, which is the world's largest cocoa producer, or the well-trodden trafficking routes through Central America and Mexico. Even the cocaine that does transit Venezuela largely comes from Colombian guerrilla groups, not Venezuelan state labs. In the case of fentanyl, virtually none of the precursor chemicals or pill mills are in Venezuela. The supply chains originate in Asia, often China, and the finished product enters the US primarily via Mexico. To put it plainly, the narco-terrorism rationale appears flimsy. A Council on Foreign Relations analysis bluntly noted that while Trump blames Venezuela for US-bound drugs, quote, "Experts believe Venezuela plays no role in the trafficking of fentanyl and a limited role in the cocaine trade," end quote. U.S. officials have provided little to no concrete evidence tying the specific Venezuelan boats they blew up to drug cargo. Why then persist with this narrative? History offers a clue. Invoking a noble cause, be it fighting communism or terrorism or drugs, has often been the preferred cover for U.S. intervention. It provides legal justification and a moral clarity to an otherwise complex power play. In Vietnam, it was the domino theory against communism. In the 1989 Panama invasion, it was ousting a drug-dealing dictator. In 2003 Iraq, it was, spuriously, weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Now in Venezuela, the war on drugs is the handy pretext. Labeling Maduro a narco-fiend serves to both demonize him and invoke a sense of self-defense exception for the use of force. Indeed, the Trump administration has claimed its campaign against Venezuelan vessels is an armed conflict akin to war, meaning, in its view, normal peacetime rules don't apply. This claim is highly controversial. Legal scholars call the maritime strikes illegal extrajudicial killings in absence of any due process or authorization. But it shows how the drug war narrative is being used to blur the line between law enforcement and warfare. Moreover, top US leaders have hardly concealed that regime change is the ultimate goal. Trump and his advisors have consistently said the real target is Maduro's rule, not just some drug gangs. In November 2025, Trump reportedly gave Maduro an ultimatum by phone to relinquish power immediately. He had already authorized covert CIA operations inside Venezuela, aimed at destabilizing the regime. Simultaneously, the US threw its weight behind opposition figure Maria Corina Machado, winner of a Nobel Peace Prize and a leading voice against Maduro, in hopes of installing a friendly government. These actions align poorly with a narrow counter-narcotics mission, but very well with a broader geopolitical intervention. In essence, the drug war is a sales pitch, one that garners domestic support, who's going to defend narco-terrorists, and gives a sheen of legitimacy to US military actions. It exploits a genuine issue, drug trafficking, but inflates Venezuela's role in it to justify military measures that would otherwise be politically unpalatable. As Elizabeth Melamopoulos writes, sorry if I mispronounced that name, Washington may be, quote, opening Pandora's box, end quote, with talk of strikes on Venezuela, hoping for a quick, clean ouster of Maduro, but risks triggering instability and conflict instead. If that box is open, history suggests it will not be the drug trade that most concerns American planners, but rather the strategic outcome. Who governs Venezuela and under whose influence? Pushing back the dragon. US-China rivalry in Latin America. Beyond the rhetoric about narcotics, one of the clearest drivers of US policy in Venezuela and Latin America at large is the strategic contest with China. Over the past 2 decades, China has dramatically expanded its footprint across Latin America through trade, investment, loans, and diplomatic outreach. Beijing's engagement has been sweeping. More than 20 countries in the region have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative, including resource-rich nations like Brazil and Peru. China is now the top trading partner for South America's largest economies and a major lender to many governments. Nowhere has this influence been more pronounced than in Venezuela. According to data compiled by the Inter-American Dialogue, Venezuela is by far China's biggest debtor in Latin America, owing nearly $60 billion to Chinese state banks from loans mostly tied to oil projects. Beijing effectively bankrolled the Chavez and Maduro governments during the 2000s and 2010s, receiving oil in return and securing a foothold in Venezuela's energy sector. From Washington's perspective, these trends are a direct challenge to US hegemony in its sphere. In a June 2025 CFR report noted that, quote, Beijing's increasing sway in the region continues to raise concerns in Washington, prompting greater US engagement, end quote. In other words, Chinese influence is the spur for the US to re-engage robustly in Latin America after a period of relative neglect. The Trump administration has treated this almost as a new Cold War theater. When Secretary of State, a Cuba hardliner, Marco Rubio, visited Panama in early 2025, it was no coincidence that Panama promptly withdrew from the BRI and initiated audits of Chinese port operators. Likewise, US officials have latched on to every pro-US shift in the region. For example, publicly lauding El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele for his tough anti-gang policies and hinting that such stability makes Chinese inroads less attractive. Despite Bukele himself balancing relations with Beijing. And in Argentina, when a China skeptic libertarian, Javier Milei, won the presidency in 2023, the US Treasury moved swiftly to support him with extraordinary measures to stabilize Argentina's economy, clearly aiming to preempt any turn back toward Chinese financing. Perhaps the most telling example is Argentina's debt saga. In 2018, Buenos Aires received a record $57 billion in IMF bailout, widely seen as influenced by the US. The US being the IMF's largest shareholder, to prop up a friendly government and keep Argentina from seeking funds from China. By 2025, with Argentina still in crisis, the US Treasury under Scott Bessent undertook unprecedented actions, directly buying Argentine pesos and arranging swap lines and private loans to Buenos Aires. The Peterson Institute's former chief economist, Maurice Obstfeld, observed that Washington's unspoken motives were to, quote, counter China regional influence and gain preferential access to Argentina's wealth of energy, lithium, and copper, end quote. Those are strategic assets China also covets, and the US seems intent on not ceding them. Indeed, Argentina has huge lithium reserves, essential for EV batteries, and abundant shale oil and gas, making it a battleground for influence between Beijing and Washington. Venezuela, similarly, sits at the nexus of US-China competition. Over 20 years, China cultivated a, quote, comprehensive strategic partnership, end quote, with Venezuela. It provided Venezuela with loans for oil, infrastructure projects, and even telecommunications tech. Chinese telecoms built much of Venezuela's surveillance and communication networks, and Chinese firms have mined gold and other minerals under deals with Caracas. Militarily, Venezuela became the region's top purchaser of Chinese weaponry after the US banned arms sales to Caracas in 2006. This included Chinese fighter jets, radars, and other hardware that partially filled the void left by Western sanctions. To Washington, these ties are alarming. They mean a hostile regime in the Americas is plugged into Chinese capital, technology, and potentially intelligence sharing. In a future conflict or standoff, China's foothold in Venezuela, or ports in Panama, or telecom networks elsewhere could undermine US operations or give Beijing leverage close to US borders. Thus, a strong incentive exists for the US to break the China-Caracas axis. Removing Maduro and installing a pro-Western government would likely result in curtailing Chinese access, perhaps renegotiating or canceling certain Chinese loans and projects, and certainly denying China any military or intelligence presence on Venezuelan soil. Trump's officials have explicitly connected these dots. In one telling episode, Trump complained that China was taking over the Panama Canal and celebrated when a US firm, BlackRock, moved to purchase ports at the canal's ends from a Hong Kong company, calling it proof the US was reclaiming the canal. The Chinese government retorted by pointing out the only time the canal was ever closed was during the 1989 US invasion of Panama, explicitly asking who truly threatens the region's stability. For Latin Americans, such exchanges revive memories of Yankee imperialism versus outsider meddling, neither of which is welcome. For the US strategists, it's straightforward calculation. If we don't dominate these domestic nodes and resources, China or others will. Indeed, the great power chessboard, Latin America, is one arena where the US still holds many advantages due to geography, historical ties, and economic influence. Unlike in East Asia or Africa, where China's rise is hard for the US to counter directly, in the Americas, the US can apply immense pressure relatively close to home. Venezuela is experiencing that pressure now. The overarching pattern is clear. A CFR backgrounder described China as presenting itself as a champion of the developing world and offering an alternative to US dominance. The US, in turn, is responding by trying to make Latin America an exclusive sphere again, using carrots, IMF rescues, aid, diplomatic support for friendly leaders, and sticks, sanctions, military deployments, threats of force, to pull countries back from Beijing's orbit. The outcome in Venezuela could either validate this approach or expose its limits, but the intensity of US resolve, deploying an aircraft carrier and tens of thousands of troops near Venezuela's coast, sends a message far beyond Venezuela. China, keep out of our hemisphere. Resource riches, oil, minerals, and the strategic heart of Venezuela. Venezuela's natural resource wealth has long been at the center of its global significance, and it is undoubtedly a core reason the US cares so much about who governs Caracas. Oil is the big one. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela was a top oil exporter and a key supplier to the United States. Even today, in an era of US shale abundance, Venezuela's vast, heavy crude deposits represent a strategic prize in a world still heavily reliant on petroleum. Controlling, or at least having friendly access to, such reserves is a major geopolitical advantage. American officials have openly acknowledged oil as a factor in their Venezuela calculus. In January 2019, at the height of the crisis over Maduro's contested re-election, John Bolton went on Fox Business and candidly stated, quote, "It will make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela," end quote. This remarkably frank admission laid bare what many suspected. Washington envisioned a post-Maduro Venezuela opening its oil industry, nationalized under Chavez, to U.S. firms like Chevron, ExxonMobil, and others. In fact, while Bolton was making those comments, the Trump administration was simultaneously tightening the noose on Venezuela's state oil company with heavy sanctions. The aim was clear: starve Maduro of oil revenues and position a future-friendly government, perhaps led by opposition leader Juan Guaido, whom the U.S. recognized as interim president in 2019, to hand lucrative oil concessions to Western corporations as part of rebuilding the shattered economy. Those plans never came to fruition in 2019 or 2020, but the ambitions remain. In late 2023, the Biden administration took a different tack. It eased some oil sanctions temporarily in exchange for the Maduro government promising to allow a competitive 2024 election. This suggested access to oil was a bargaining chip even for a Democratic administration. Under Trump's renewed pressure campaign in 2025, however, the stance has returned to regime change, with oil as the spoil for the victor. The logic from a U.S. national security perspective is straightforward. Better that American and allied companies exploit Venezuela's oil than the current scenario where China, Russia, or Iran help Venezuela bypass U.S. sanctions to monetize its crude. Moreover, integrating Venezuelan oil back into the U.S.-led global oil system could help stabilize prices and supply, a significant consideration given recent volatility from wars and OPEC Plus maneuvers. A stable flow of Venezuelan oil, which is heavy and best processed by certain U.S. Gulf Coast refineries, would reduce U.S. reliance on Middle East oil and give Washington more leverage against other producers like Iran or Russia. But it's not just oil. Venezuela is often termed a geological scandal for its sheer abundance of minerals: gold, bauxite, aluminum ore, iron ore, diamonds, and coltan, a dull black ore that is a source of tantalum, used in high-performance electronics. In recent years, attention has also turned to rare earth elements and other critical minerals in Venezuela's remote southern regions. These materials, including elements like neodymium and dysprosium, are vital for the production of everything from smartphones and electric vehicle batteries to wind turbines, missile systems, and jet engines. Currently, China dominates the global processing and supply of rare earths, which alarms the US as it tries to transition to clean energy and maintain its military tech edge. If Venezuela holds significant untapped reserves of such minerals, it becomes part of a new resource race. Evidence is emerging that it does. Venezuela's Guiana Shield, the geological formation underlying the Amazon rainforest region, is rich in minerals like tin and tungsten, tantalum, and possibly rare earth elements. Hugo Chavez himself announced in 2009 that Venezuela had found a great reserve of blue gold, his term for coltan, noting that wars had been fought over it in Africa. Since then, the Venezuelan government has created the Orinoco Mining Arc, an enormous concessionary zone covering 112,000 square kilometers, about 12% of the country, to legalize mining of gold, coltan, and other minerals. This anarchic plunders devastating rainforests and indigenous communities, but it also hints at a geopolitical undercurrent. Chinese-linked actors are sourcing Venezuelan critical minerals on the sly, perhaps to feed China's tech supply chains, thereby outflanking U.S. sanctions. For U.S. policymakers concerned with supply chain security, this is unacceptable. They have already placed strategic importance on securing lithium, found in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, and rare earths mined in China and Burma primarily to avoid dependence on China. If Venezuela, a country in the US's backyard, holds meaningful reserves of these, letting them fall under China's orbit or leave black markets would be a strategic own goal. An observer quoted by The Guardian noted that rare earth elements are now influencing conflicts at an international level. Given their importance to clean energy and defense industries, control of such resources can shape the future balance of power in high-tech manufacturing and military capability. To summarize, Venezuela's resources heighten the stakes of the current US-Venezuela standoff. It's not just an ideological or abstract fight about democracy versus autocracy. It's tangibly about oil wells, gold mines, and coltan pits. Whoever ends up with the reins of those assets, whether it's US companies, Chinese estate firms, Russian intermediaries, or illicit networks, will derive both profits and strategic advantage. The US appears determined that it should be the one left holding the keys. National security planners surely recall the oft-cited, if cynical, maxim, quote, America's middle class will never fight a war for coltan, end quote, but they might for cheap gas. In Venezuela, oil and critical minerals have bundled together a treasure trove in the ground. By ensuring those riches are developed in alignment with US interests and not in ways that empower China or rogue regimes, Washington would secure a strong position in the global energy transition and the ongoing competition over high-tech resources. As Bolton quipped, Maduro's ouster combined with US investment could transform Venezuela's oil sector to the benefit of Americans, and by extension deprive US rivals of a valuable card. It is realpolitik resource logic, dressed up in the language of freedom and rule of law. A perfect storm. Russia's weakness, China's caution, and the multipolar moment. Timing is everything. The US government's aggressive posture towards Venezuela in 2025 is not happening in a vacuum. It comes at a moment when the international context is unusually favorable for Washington to act. Three global trends converge here: Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine, China's limited appetite for confrontation in the Americas, and an inflection point in the world order where the US hegemony faces new challenges. Each of these factors weighs into the American calculus on Venezuela. First, Russia's diminished capacity. Venezuela, under both Chavez and Maduro, cultivated a close alliance with Moscow, purchasing billions in Russian weapons, from fighter jets to air defense systems, welcoming Russian oil companies into joint ventures and receiving financial lifelines and military advisors from the Kremlin. In return, Venezuela provided Russia a geopolitical foothold in the Western Hemisphere and staunch diplomatic support, such as at the UN. However, since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, its ability to project power abroad has been severely curtailed. 3 years on, by late 2025, Russia is bogged down in a grueling war, facing sanctions and military losses that demand its focus and resources closer to home. As a result, Moscow has comparatively little bandwidth to intervene forcefully in Venezuela. This is evidenced by recent events when US-Venezuelan tensions spiked in late 2025. Vladimir Putin made a point of calling Maduro to reaffirm support, but the support amounted mainly to words of solidarity and talk of joint economic projects. There is no indication of substantive Russian military aid or intervention forthcoming. The Kremlin statement spoke of implementing strategic partnership agreements in economy and energy, suggesting Russia might try to maintain its oil ventures or even increase trade with Caracas. But notably, US intelligence did not detect any significant Russian naval or air deployments to the Caribbean to counter the Americans. In essence, Putin can only promise Maduro he has his back, but he cannot actually put much muscle behind it without risking overstretch. Maduro surely recognizes this. Russia is fighting for its geopolitical life in Eastern Europe. It can ill afford a showdown in the Americas. Even the traditional token gestures, like dispatching a couple of Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers to Venezuela, as was done in 2018, are harder now given the war effort and aircraft losses. Some months ago, Russia did send a token shipment of fuel and some military trainers to Venezuela, but nothing game-changing. For Washington, this is an ideal scenario. One leg of the anti-US triad, Russia, China, Iran, propping up Maduro is limping badly. US officials likely assess that Russia will complain loudly and veto any UNSC action, but ultimately not directly confront US forces over Venezuela. In a sense, the Ukraine war removed a potential deterrent to US action in Latin America. Second, China's cautious stance. As discussed, China has enormous interest in Venezuela, chiefly getting repaid for its loans in oil and ensuring its companies benefit from Venezuelan resources. Politically, China opposes US sanctions on Venezuela and has consistently spoken against external interference in the country's internal affairs. However, Beijing's support for Maduro has been measured. Chinese leaders have not sent military forces or advanced weapons to help Maduro, beyond earlier sales of commercial drones and air defense radars. And crucially, analysts assess that China is unlikely to directly confront the US or provide military aid if the US moves against Maduro. The South China Morning Post in December 2025 quoted experts saying, Beijing, quote, offers limited support, prioritizing its economic interests and long-term gains, end quote. And that while it condemns US pressure, it has shown, quote, no sign it would defend the Venezuelan leader, end quote. In fact, China might see an upside if the US becomes bogged down policing its hemisphere, as it could distract Washington from the Indo-Pacific, a point SCMP noted about how a US shift back to old-style sphere of influence behavior might one day favor China's own ambitions in Asia, for example, Taiwan. So far, China's reaction to the US naval buildup has been mostly rhetorical. The Chinese Foreign Ministry in late 2025 urged the US not to use force and insisted Latin America should remain a zone of peace. Chinese state media echoed that the US is bullying Venezuela under a false pretext. But there is a telling line in reports. Quote, Maduro's, allies, however, have offered little beyond rhetorical backing. Russia has pledged to monitor the situation, and China has limited its response to call for restraint. End quote. This implies Beijing, for all its anti-intervention principle, will not stick its neck out to save Maduro if things escalate. China tends to safeguard its nationals and investments quietly. For instance, it reportedly evacuated some personnel when Venezuela's unrest peaked in 2019, and then worked with whichever government emerges to recoup its loans. In realpolitik terms, if a pro-US government succeeded Maduro, China might lose some influence, but it would likely still pursue business there, as it does in pro-US countries. Beijing might hedge by maintaining quiet links with Venezuela's opposition too. Some reports have suggested China engaged the opposition team in the past to assure its loans would be honored. All this means China is not all in behind Maduro the way the Soviet Union was behind Cuba in 1962, for example. The risk of a direct superpower showdown over Venezuela is therefore lower, emboldening Washington. Third, the broader multipolar moment and the dollar supremacy is at stake. The US sees a world emerging where its unipolar dominance is eroding. And nowhere is this more evident than in the challenge to the US dollar hegemony. China, Russia, and other rising powers are working to build alternative financial systems and reduce reliance on the dollar for trade and reserves. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and recently expanding to include others like Saudi Arabia and Iran, has openly discussed creating a new reserve currency or increasing the use of local currencies in trade. US policymakers are taking these moves seriously. In July 2025, President Trump bluntly told his cabinet that, quote, BRICS was set up to hurt us, to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar off as the standard, end quote. His warning underscores a fear in Washington that BRICS and other initiatives could, over time, chip away at the dollar's central role, which has been a pillar of the American global power since 1945. Venezuela ties into this in a couple of ways. Firstly, Venezuela under Chavez, and now Maduro, was a pioneer among Latin nations in attempting to bypass the dollar, trading oil in barter arrangements, swapping oil for Chinese yuan loans, or even launching cryptocurrency, petro, in a failed bid to circumvent US banking sanctions. It also talked of joining alternative institutions like the BRICS New Development Bank, if invited. Such defiance directly challenges the US sanctions regime and the dollar's ubiquity in a commodity trade. A Venezuela that trades its oil in yuan or gold weakens the petrodollar system at the margins. If multiple Latin American countries were to do so in concert, say under a wave of leftist anti-US governments aligned with China and Russia, it could start to undermine US financial leverage. Therefore, reasserting influence over Venezuela is partly about shoring up the dollar-dominated order in the Americas. A friendly Caracas would presumably reintegrate with the US and international financial system, use the dollar in oil transactions, and not advocate for BRICS alternatives. Success in Venezuela could have a chilling effect on other would-be BRICS aspirants in Latin America. It's notable that when BRICS announced an expansion in 2023, Argentina, under a China-friendly government at the time, was invited to join. But by the time the accession would occur in 2024, Argentina's new US allied president, Milei, indicated he might reject membership. Other Latin populist authoritarian regimes like Cuba and Nicaragua, and of course Venezuela itself, have shown interest in closer alignment with BRICS or China's Belt and Road as a counterweight to US pressure. The US crackdown on Maduro serves as a message to those countries. Siding with Washington rivals can carry severe costs. Conversely, those who distance from China and Russia, like Panama did by quitting the BRI, or like Ecuador electing a pro-US president in 2023, are rewarded. It's a classic carrot and stick to prevent Latin America from tilting into a China-Russia-led bloc that could collectively undermine US dominance, whether through de-dollarization, voting against the US in international fora, or granting military access to adversaries. Finally, the Ukraine war's outcome, with Russia's weakened and rising US-China tensions, had convinced many in Washington that we are at a defining juncture. Either the US moves assertively to shore up its global position, or risks ceding regional primacy and credibility. The Western Hemisphere is the one region the US arguably must not lose influence in if it hopes to maintain global leadership. This was true in 1823 and remains true in 2025. As one Hudson Institute analysis observed, quote, "Since Bretton Woods, dollar primacy has served as the foundation of American global power," end quote. And while BRICS isn't yet cohesive enough to topple the dollar, its promotion of alternatives undermines the legitimacy of the US-led world order. Washington likely views a reassertion of dominance in its hemisphere as a way to reinforce that order. It not only secures nearby resources and allies, but also demonstrates US resolve and deters rivals from further encroachment. In light of these factors, the US push on Venezuela in late 2025 appears far from coincidental. It looks strategically timed. With Russia tied down and China reluctant to fight over Latin America, the risk of external escalation is low. With many Latin economies struggling, and thus arguably more malleable with financial incentives, and a number of elections bringing US-friendly leaders to power, the regional winds are favorable, with global geopolitics at an inflection point. Washington sees now is the time to send a clear signal that, despite talk of multipolarity, the Western Hemisphere is off limits to rival powers' domination. As a US Southern Command official might put it, if there's a Monroe Doctrine 2.0 moment, this is it. Counter-arguments and contradictions. It is important to acknowledge that not everyone, not even all Americans, agree with the interpretation that US actions in Venezuela are driven by imperial designs. US officials maintain there are principled reasons for their policy, defending democracy, human rights, and stemming a humanitarian catastrophe. The Maduro government's record provides ample grounds for concern, independent of great power rivalry, a collapsed economy, mass hunger, millions of refugees, jailing of opponents, and involvement in illicit activities from drug trafficking to gold smuggling. The US and dozens of other countries recognize Maduro's 2018 re-election as fraudulent, and in their view, supporting Venezuela's democratic opposition is a moral and legal imperative. From this perspective, any US intervention, even militarily, could be framed as helping liberate the Venezuelan people from tyranny and kleptocracy. The US government has repeatedly stressed it prefers a peaceful, negotiated transition in Venezuela, and that all options, economic, diplomatic, short of force, were tried over the years. The Biden administration in 2023 did attempt a diplomatic route, easing some oil sanctions in exchange for the regime agreeing to a presidential election with international observers. Critics of the current hardline could argue this approach was starting to show modest progress. For example, Maduro's regime did sit for talks and promise an election, and that the renewed military threat risks derailing those diplomatic gains. However, this stated commitment to democracy must be weighed against the long history of US-backed regime change efforts, many of which targeted democratically elected governments when those governments conflicted with the US interests. This includes the 1953 CIA-led coup in Iran, which removed Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized British oil interests, the 1973 coup in Chile against President Salvador Allende, a democratically elected socialist, and the 1954 overthrow of Guatemala's Jacobo Arbenz. More recently, US support for the 2014 Ukrainian Maidan movement, which ousted President Viktor Yanukovych, has been interpreted by critics as another example of externally influenced regime change. In Latin America specifically, the US has a long record of replacing left-leaning governments, from Nicaragua to Honduras, in the name of stability or anti-communism. These precedents cast doubt on the notion that US regime change efforts are solely or even primarily motivated by democratic ideals. Instead, they often coincide with strategic or economic imperatives, such as securing oil, access to markets, or blocking Soviet, now Chinese or Russian, influence. A further risk lies in the unintended consequences of regime change, which history has repeatedly shown can backfire. One notable example is the 2011 NATO-led overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, which was also framed around humanitarian protection and support for democracy. In practice, it led to a power vacuum, civil war, and a collapse of state institutions. Europe experienced massive blowback from this intervention as the instability fueled large-scale migration across the Mediterranean, empowering smuggling networks and contributing to political upheaval in EU member states. If the US topples Maduro without a stable transition plan, a similar outcome could emerge. Venezuela could descend into factional conflict and criminal anarchy, or a failed state scenario triggering unchecked migration flows northward through Colombia, Central America, and ultimately toward the US border. Venezuela already has the world's largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. An unmanaged collapse could exponentially worsen the burden on neighboring countries and US border infrastructure, turning a geopolitical win into a long-term humanitarian and security liability. Furthermore, while US leaders deny an intention of stealing Venezuelan resources, the optics of Bolton's comments about oil and the presence of US oil executives in discussions with the Venezuelan opposition have fueled skepticism abroad. Venezuelan officials and their allies like Cuba claim the US simply wants to loot Venezuela's oil and recolonize the country. They point to Iraq and Libya as examples where US-led interventions left chaos and allowed Western companies greater access to oil. American diplomats refute this, insisting any post-Maduro development of Venezuela's oil would be to benefit the Venezuelan people and stabilize global markets, not to enrich the US per se. Nonetheless, the perception of a resource grab is hard to dispel given historical precedent, and it feeds into local resistance. Even many Venezuelans who dislike Maduro are wary of US military involvement, recalling the checkered history of US interventions in Latin America. Another strong counterargument is practical. Military intervention in Venezuela could be extremely messy and counterproductive. Venezuela is a large country of 28 million people with difficult terrain, of jungles and mountains, and an entrenched security apparatus. US officials may hope for a swift strike that decapitates the regime or a popular uprising that topples Maduro once the US force is imminent, but analysts warn this is optimistic. The Al Jazeera explainer, cited earlier, noted that a US strike could trigger instability rather than a peaceful transition, potentially leading to a protracted conflict among factions, military loyalists, paramilitary collectivos, insurgent groups, and even urban warfare. A former US Marine Colonel, Mark Cancian, told Al Jazeera that while the US certainly has the capability to bombard Venezuelan targets, nearly all experts have ruled out a ground invasion. Given the troop numbers that would require, likely hundreds of thousands as in Iraq, and the specter of an Iraq-Afghanistan-style quagmire, without a massive ground force, it's unclear if a limited air naval campaign would actually force Maduro out. It could also rally nationalist sentiment around him. The US would then face the nightmare of owning the chaos that ensues or pulling back and leaving a failed state. This risk tempers the notion that the US can simply waltz in and take control of Venezuela's assets. High-ranking Pentagon officials are reportedly cautious. Even during Trump's first term, the idea of invading Venezuela was floated and largely shot down by the military as reckless. Additionally, Latin American regional opposition to US armed intervention is a significant factor. Countries in the hemisphere, even those critical to Maduro, generally adhere to a doctrine of non-intervention, a reaction to the long history of US incursions. Organizations like the OAS and leaders from Mexico, Argentina, even Milei has said he opposes outright invasion, and others have indicated they don't support unilateral US force in Venezuela. If the US acted alone, it could isolate Washington diplomatically and revive old resentments of Yankee imperialism. This could, ironically, drive some nations closer to China or Russia out of distrust of Washington. Thus, one could argue that the smarter US play is a soft power one. Outcompete China in aid and investment and help negotiate democratic outcomes, rather than military dominance that could backfire. It's worth noting that within the US there are differing views. While the Trump administration and many in Congress favor a hard line, some policymakers and analysts advocate a more pragmatic approach, negotiating a gradual political opening in Venezuela, perhaps even accepting a power-sharing interim government in order to avoid bloodshed. These voices caution that a collapsed Venezuela, civil war, or state failure could trigger even greater refugee flows, instability on Colombian borders, and decades of costly reconstruction, outcomes not actually in the US national interests. They also point out that the US energy security is no longer as dependent on foreign oil as the past, thanks to the shale revolution. Thus, controlling Venezuela's oil, while beneficial, is not an absolute necessity. The US already gets oil from a variety of sources, and globally markets adjust. For example, when Venezuelan heavy crude was sanctioned, US refineries found alternatives from Canada and elsewhere. And lastly, the narrative that everything is about US-China rivalry can be seen as overly deterministic. Latin American countries have agency and can play both powers to their advantage. Some experts believe that Latin America is not destined to be dominated by one or the other, but can maintain a balance, accepting Chinese investment while keeping political ties to the US. If that's true, the confrontational US approach might be counterproductive, as it forces countries into choosing sides. A less confrontational approach might actually yield more influence. For example, offering development help without ultimatums might peel countries away from Chinese dependence. In Venezuela's case, this would mean focusing on humanitarian assistance and diplomacy, not just military threats. To summarize this, while the evidence strongly supports the thesis of ulterior US motives, we must recognize the official rationale and real risks. The US government insists it is upholding democracy, fighting criminal cartels, not embarking on resource-driven conquest. Many Venezuelan and Latin Americans remain skeptical of the US intentions, remembering the imperialist undertones of the Monroe Doctrine that once justified US occupations. And indeed, if Washington's true aim is regional stability and keeping China out, an all-out conflict could undermine both by creating chaos that invites more outside meddling or humanitarian disaster. These counterpoints do not erase the evidence of strategic intent behind US actions, but they do frame the complexity of the issue. The US wants to control outcomes in Venezuela, yet must avoid the perception and reality of a neo-colonial venture. Squaring that circle, aligning its tactics with its lofty rhetoric, will be the challenge going forward. I want to conclude with this. The unfolding US-Venezuela confrontation is about far more than drug trafficking or one dictator's grip on power. It encapsulates the larger forces reshaping international relations in our era. At its core, the US campaign to pressure or unseat Maduro is a bid to reassert American primacy in the Western Hemisphere at a time of growing multipolar competition. The evidence, as I have shown, points to a confluence of motives. Geostrategic doctrine, a revival of Monroe Doctrine thinking, keeping foreign powers out of America's backyard. US leaders from John Bolton to Donald Trump have explicitly tied today's policy to that 200-year-old mandate, signaling Washington's refusal to accept Chinese or Russian penetration into Latin America. In a sense, Venezuela is a line in the sand, a message that the US will actively roll back rival influence close to home, even as it perhaps pulls back from distant conflicts. Pretext and legitimacy. The war on drugs has been leveraged as the convenient pretext to mobilize domestic and international support. By labeling the Venezuelan regime a narco-terrorist threat, the US secured a public rationale for a military buildup that would otherwise be hard to justify. Yet behind that pretext lies a broader agenda, one that became apparent as US forces assembled a capability, quote, enough to conduct strikes against Venezuela, end quote, and Trump spoke openly of regime change. Resource security. Control of Venezuela's vast oil and mineral wealth is a prize intertwined with US strategic interests. Oil remains the lifeblood of the global economy and a key to US allies' energy security, and Venezuela has more of it underground than Saudi Arabia. In turn, the critical minerals buried in Venezuela's jungles could feed the tech industries of the 21st century, or be exploited by America's adversaries if left unchecked. As one analysis succinctly put it, Washington's moves suggest a desire for preferential access to these riches while denying them to rivals. Great power rivalry. Above all, the context of US versus China and Russia looms over every facet of the Venezuela issue. Beijing's deep investments in Caracas and Moscow's alliance with Maduro have made Venezuela's a front line in the contest over the global balance of power. The US is effectively executing a containment strategy on China and Russia within the hemisphere, using economic leverage, diplomatic pressure, and the implicit or explicit threat of force. As President Trump's remarks about BRICS revealed, US leaders see adversarial blocs and currency arrangements as direct threats to US dominance. Keeping China out of Latin America and the dollar supreme are overarching strategic goals served by bringing Venezuela back into the US-led fold. Taken together, these factors paint a picture of a policy that is realpolitik in idealist clothing. Officially about drugs and democracy, it is in practice about power, who wields it in the Western Hemisphere, and how that affects the global chessboard. The historical through line from the Cold War to now is striking. Just as the US once intervened in places like Cuba and Guatemala or Grenada to thwart Soviet influence and secure resources, it is now positioning itself to do the same vis-a-vis China and other challengers, with Venezuela as a prime theater. Of course, this strategy is not without peril or controversy. The next chapters are unwritten. Will the US actually use overt military force? And if so, will it achieve a quick victory or sink into a quagmire? How will China and Russia respond in the long run? Will they double down elsewhere in Latin America as a counter move? Or crucially, what do the Venezuelans themselves desire for their country's future? A US-aligned government might attract investment and reduce sanctions, but it could also face legitimacy issues if brought to power by foreign pressure. The lesson of history urged caution. Latin America's peoples have often chafed at outside domination. whether from Washington or anyone else. A stable outcome in Venezuela that truly benefits its citizens would require not just an American might, but also astute diplomacy and respect for Venezuelan sovereignty in the aftermath of any transition. Nonetheless, from Washington's strategic vantage point in late 2025, the stars have aligned for a bold attempt to reset the balance of power in its favor. A weakened Russia, a cautious China, and a hemisphere with several new pro-US leaders in Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina present an opportune moment. If the US succeeds in Venezuela, whether by compelling Maduro to step down or by engineering a peaceful handover, it will stand as a potent demonstration that the US still enforces a de facto Monroe Doctrine. It will assert that even in a purportedly multipolar world, the Western Hemisphere remains a US sphere where challenges to its influence, be they drug cartels, extra-hemispheric powers, or authoritarian regimes, will be met with forceful resistance. In closing, the drama over Venezuela's future is more than a regional quarrel. It is a microcosm of the transitional world order. Energy security, great power rivalry, and the principles of sovereignty are colliding in this crisis. The implications for the global energy landscape are significant. Control of oil and critical minerals in friendly hands could bolster US and allied economies, whereas losing them to strategic competitors could shift supply chains and influence. Likewise, the implications for global norms are profound. A US intervention, even if justified by normal aims, will be read by others as a statement that the Pax Americana, at least in the Americas, is not ready to fade quietly. The coming months will reveal whether the United States can achieve its aims in Venezuela without unleashing the very chaos it seeks to prevent, and whether the Western Hemisphere will indeed become, as US leaders hope, a fortress of US influence in an uncertain multipolar age. I want to thank you for joining me in today's episode of Practical Energy Insights podcast. If you like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe, as it really helps out this channel to grow. And leave a note in the comments if you have anything that you agree or disagree with. I would love to hear your opinion. As always, thanks for listening.